So good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us here tonight. We want to recognize that tonight is also Erev Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, and we'll refer to that as well at the end of this session. But nevertheless, thank you for taking your time for joining us. My name is Ol Shaked, Deputy Director of the Jewish Virtual Library, or JVL. We're thrilled to welcome you to today's webinar, which explores one of the most complex and often misunderstood conflicts in modern history. That is, of course, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. To start, I'd like to introduce our organization. JVL is dedicated to fostering strong ties between Israel and the U.S., particularly at a time when access to accurate information is not necessarily at our disposal. One second, sorry. Since 1997, the JVL has grown to include over 26,000 articles, becoming the most comprehensive online resource on Jewish and Israeli history, politics, and culture. The JVL is a trusted resource for students, educators, journalists, and the general public. After October 7th, over 2 million people relied on the JVL for reliable information amid a flood of misinformation about the war in Gaza, underscoring the library's essential role in providing clear and factual insights. I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker, Dr. Mitchell Bard, who is the Executive Director of the JVL, an authority on U.S. Middle East policy. Dr. Bard has appeared on international, national, and local TV and radio outlets, and his articles are published in major newspapers, magazines, and academic journals. He is the author of 22 books. He holds a PhD in political science from UCLA, a master's degree in public policy from Berkeley, and a BA in economics from UC Santa Barbara. Dr. Bard will guide us through more than a century of history using maps that trace the region's shifting boundaries, from the Ottoman period through the British Mandate, the 1947 UN Partition Plan, and the evolving contours of peace proposals and Israeli settlements. We'll explore the historical identity of the land before the name Palestine gained political significance, the role of British policies like Churchill's creation of Transjordan, the major Arab-Israeli wars, and the repeated Palestinian rejections of statehood. We'll also examine how ideology, religion, and politics have shaped competing narratives. We encourage you to take notes and ask Dr. Bard thoughtful questions in the chat box. Upon this presentation's conclusion, we will review the questions and present them to Dr. Bard for him to answer. Dr. Bard, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Or, and thank you all for joining us. We're going to do also much more than that. In fact, we're going to try to cover 3,000 years of history in about an hour. So fair warning, there are no bathroom breaks. I assume that many of you will know a lot of this history, but hopefully you'll pick up a few things that perhaps you didn't know before and will help you better understand one of the long-standing conflicts in the world, and one which often is reduced to the question of two people fighting over one land. And I would argue and will argue that it's actually much more complicated than that, and that it really begins back in ancient times. And let's see if we can start the project. And we will share my screen, and there you go. We're off and running with the geography of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And I'm going to start not exactly at the beginning, but with the whole question of where is Palestine? When we talk about this infamous area, what is it exactly we're talking about? Where did this whole idea come from? Where's the word even coming from? And interestingly enough, as some of you may know, the word Palestine or Philistine in Arabic doesn't appear anywhere in the Quran, the Old or the New Testament. It really is a relatively new word that in ancient times in Egyptian and Hebrew was called Peleshet, which was a word to describe the Philistines, which were a seafaring people along the coast area of what is now Israel. For Jews and Israelites, This area has always been referred to as Eretz Israel, or the land of Israel children, dating back almost 1500 BC. For a while, the area was called Judea when it was under the Romans around the time of 300 before the Common Era. It didn't become Palestine, although originally called Palestina, until the Roman Emperor Hadrian renamed what was Judea, Palestina, in about 136 of the Common Era. The word Palestine didn't become used commonly until the Middle Ages, the Crusades, when early modern English began to refer to the area as Palestine, and you began to see maps of the area using Palestine to describe it. It wasn't until the 7th century, the Muslim conquest, that the word Palestine became introduced as a way of describing that area in the Arabic and Muslim world. For about 400 years, during the Ottoman Empire, Palestine was basically a general term for the south of Syria and was not an independent entity that had any kind of significance. For the Arabs who lived in Palestine, as I'll talk about in a little bit, this also was not a independent area. It was considered part of southern Syria, and that is what they aspired to, is to establish a regime that would be ruled through Syria. We'll get to that again in a minute. For about 2,600 years then, anyone who lived in the area that was referred to as Palestine, whether they were Jews, Christians, or Muslims, were referred to generally as Palestinians. So you had the Palestine Post as the Jewish newspaper, for example, or the Palestine Symphony Orchestra as the Jewish orchestra during the Mandate period. If we go back to ancient history, you see that this is the land that we're talking about. Canaan, which was referred to in the Bible, of course, as the place where the Israelites go and they ultimately conquer after the Exodus from Egypt that we just read about in the Seder over the last week. This is the area here. Then in about the year 1020, the Jews formed the first kingdom under Saul, David, and Solomon. That kingdom lasted for hundreds of years, and you can see what the area encompassed. That included parts of Syria, like Damascus, and also parts of what's now Jordan, like Amman. And it was an extensive area ruled by the Jews for hundreds of years. And it wasn't until foreign conquerors came along that they lost sovereignty. But first, the Jews fought among themselves. And as a result of the fighting among themselves, the kingdom of Israel was divided into two. First, you had a revolt against the son of Solomon around 931 BCE, and that led to the tribe of Judah and Benjamin forming the new kingdom of Judah under a different ruler. The other 10 tribes established a northern kingdom, which they called Israel, and was under the rule of Jeroboam. These are the areas, again, you can see the kingdom of Israel in the north and some of the area that it covered, and the kingdom of Judah. It was in the year 722 that the Assyrians conquered the kingdom of Israel. It was independent for 200 years. And then it was the Babylonians who conquered Judah in around 586, and Judah lasted for 350 years. So think about that for a second, that Jews had a kingdom in the land of Israel for longer than the United States has existed. And this is part of the reason that Jews can claim to be the indigenous people of the region. This wasn't the end of independence for the Jews. It took several hundred more years before the Maccabees, also known as Hasmoneans, revolted and were able to briefly recapture parts of the land of Israel and to create an autonomous region that they ruled only for less than 20 years. But again, it was an example of how in Jewish history, the indigenous people, the Jews, ruled their land for hundreds of years in total and would be celebrating, instead of 80 years of independence, more than 3,000 years of independence if it weren't for the foreign conquerors. The Romans come and take over the land, and in 63, Pompey annexes the land of Israel for Rome. Gaza is now basically given as a gift. Here it is in the southern part, as a gift to Cleopatra from Mark Antony. And then Herod is made the king of Israel by the Romans, and Israel now is all of this blue area that you can see in this map. The Jews try to revolt to throw off the Romans in 66 BCE. It's a long revolt that results not in Jewish sovereignty returning, but instead losing to the Romans and having hundreds of thousands of people dispersed. Many of them are enslaved. They're scattered. They begin to concentrate in the area around Tiberias, where the Jewish scholars congregate and are able to keep alive Judaism in the Middle East and in the land of Israel for the next several thousand or several hundred years, several centuries. The southern part of Israel is destroyed in 363 after the Emperor Julian is killed. And now here's just an example of a map in this period after the Christians begin to dominate the world, and they refer to the land now as Palestine, or in some of the maps, Palestina. Jumping ahead all the way to the late 19th century, this is the first time the Jews began to return to their homeland in large numbers. About 35,000 come in the first Aliyah, stimulated by anti-Semitism in places like Romania and Russia. They again mostly congregate in the northern part of Israel, where the Jews had retained some semblance of community for all of those centuries. It's the end of the 19th century when Theodor Herzl comes along and develops the idea of political Zionism, the notion that Jews are not safe anywhere, that anti-Semitism is something that cannot be destroyed, and that the only way Jews can be safe is if they have a homeland of their own. And Zionism basically says that the Jewish people are a nation like any other, and that they should have a homeland in the historic land of Israel. In 1917, Lord Balfour writes a letter in which he basically lays out what becomes the British position that's also adopted by the United States and the international community, that the Jewish people should have a homeland in Palestine. Unfortunately, the British have a different idea of what should constitute the Jewish homeland. Winston Churchill decides in 1921 that all of this land that had once been Palestine should be divided, and 2/3 of it is given over to a new country that never existed before in history that they call Transjordan. The reason Churchill does this is because the Hashemite family was very instrumental in helping the British defeat the Turks in World War I, and as a reward, the king of the Hashemites, King Hussein, is given a country of his own. About 1/3 is left over for what is supposed to become the Jewish home. For a period of more than 20 years, the British are controlling all of this area under a mandate that they're given by the League of Nations and by the peace agreements after World War I.
Mitchell, sorry to interrupt. Can you make a slide view screen because it doesn't show its full screen to everybody? Thank you.
What are you saying? What's the problem?
It shows the presenter's view rather than the full screen. So if you can,
Let me see what.
we apologize for this interruption.
Let me see if I can see what you're talking about here. I don't know. Is that any different?
It is not.
I'm not sure what. I'm not sure what the problem is that you're seeing there. Let's see.
Oh,
That
there
any
you
better?
go. Much better.
Okay. All right. Let's move on. As I said, you had Churchill dividing up what had been the Jewish homeland, creates Transjordan, which becomes independent in 1946. Now, throughout this early part of the 20th century, there is a nascent Palestinian nationalism beginning to form, but most Palestinians at the beginning of the 20th century are not interested in a state in Palestine. In fact, what they want is to become part of a greater Syria and not anything, not an independent entity of their own, which has not existed at any time in history before. Now, in 1937, the British send a team to investigate why the Jews and Arabs are killing each other in Palestine. And they basically decide that the way to stop the killing is to divide up the land. You have this notion that's become sort of a mantra ever since, that if you have two people fighting over one land, what's the easiest way to resolve the issue? You divide it. Well, Peel didn't exactly divide it. He gave the Arabs a much larger share of Palestine than what was offered to the Jews, but the Arabs were unwilling to accept it. Their basic position was that they would not accept any Jewish presence at all, no Jewish state anywhere in any part of the Middle East, and therefore rejected the partition plan. The Zionists at the time were not enthusiastic about getting this tiny fragment of their homeland, but were willing to consider it had the Arabs been willing to accept it. In the end, they didn't. In 1939, the British take another whack at it and decide that one way to stop the killing, since the Arabs aren't going to accept a division, is to basically create a unitary state in Palestine with the Arabs as the majority and essentially in control of the area, and limiting the number of Jews who can immigrate, which would basically condemn millions of Jews to death in Nazi-occupied Europe. And this was unacceptable to the Zionists, but it was also unacceptable to the Arabs, even though they were getting, again, the larger share of the state. They were unwilling to concede even a small amount of it for Jewish settlement. As a result, the British basically throw up their arms and say, well, we can't solve this issue. Let's give it to this new organization called the UN and let them figure it out. The UN also sends a group of people to talk to the Jews and the Arabs in the region to try to figure out how can we solve this problem. A minority of that group of investigators from different countries comes up with their own plan, which is not that much different from the British plan. Again, it's going to create a state that's controlled by the Arabs and not giving the Jews much of a state at all, if any. And the Arabs are unwilling to accept this. The majority of the countries that investigate decide on a different kind of partition plan, which they base largely on the demography of the country. That is, they decide that where Jews are a majority, they'll make that the Jewish state. And where the Arabs are the majority, that will be the Arab state. And then because Jerusalem is this special place that's holy to three religions, we're going to internationalize that, at least for a temporary period. Now, if you look at the map, it really doesn't make much political sense, even if it made demographic sense at the time, because you have this sort of checkerboard where the Jewish state in blue is surrounded in some places by the Arab state, and similarly, the Arab state in the green is surrounded in some parts by the Jewish state, and there's no contiguity. They're broken up. The Jews are given a larger share of the land, but most of that is in the Negev, which at the time was considered barely habitable and certainly inarable. And the Arabs, even though they are getting a state of their own, once again reject the idea of having to concede any part of the land to the Jews. The Zionists decide that even though this is, again, nothing like what they had expected, which was to control the entire area of Palestine, including Jordan, but this is something and it's better than nothing. And Ben-Gurion and the other Zionist leaders decide that this is a basis from which they can build a state. The Arabs, because they reject it, decide to invade on May 14th, 1948, the same time that Israel is declaring its independence. And what people tend to forget about the Arabs invading was that they had no interest in creating a Palestinian state. That was not the reason for the invasion. They wanted to drive the Jews into the sea. They wanted to ensure that no Jewish state ever emerged, and that they would divide up what was left of Palestine among themselves. And as a result, one thing that happened was many of the Palestinians fled their homes. There were sort of three categories of Palestinians who became refugees. About 30,000 were wealthy Palestinians who left before the fighting even started because they saw the handwriting on the wall. They knew that this was going to happen, and they left to relatives and other places in the Middle East where they could find homes. A small number of Palestinians were forced out by the Israeli Defense Forces, mainly because they were in areas where there was fighting, and they were in the rear guard, where if the IDF allowed them to stay in their homes, they could pose a threat to the Israeli soldiers from behind. And so there were certain parts of certain cities and villages that were expelled. But the vast majority of Palestinians left because they didn't want to get stuck in the crossfire of a war. It made perfect sense. Why would you sit in your home while there are Arab armies and Israeli armies firing across your heads? And the Arab leaders were urging them to leave. They basically said, look, we're going to drive the Jews into the sea. When we're finished, you can come back, and not only will you have your homes back, but you can have the Jews' homes as well. And you can see where they fled to the different Arab countries in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, to Jordan, in the West Bank, to Egypt. And the propagandists like to say that there were 750,000 or 1 million Palestinians who left. The real number is probably 500,000 or less. In fact, before the war ended in September of 48, the CIA and the UN both came up with a number of about 300,000 refugees. Regardless, many Palestinians left their homes. They moved to these Arab countries, which did not allow them, with the exception of Jordan, to become citizens. Instead, they were kept in refugee camps. A UN agency, the UN Refugee and Welfare Agency, was created. The idea was they were going to help these refugees either return home or resettle in the places where they had moved. The Arab states rejected the idea of resettling them, and as a result, they stayed in camps. for the period from 47, in some cases, up until today, because the UN decided to redefine what constitutes a refugee. Instead of counting the people who left in 1947, they began to count all of their descendants, and they also began to inaccurately count who died and who was born. Became very corrupt, and basically the bottom line is, while there probably are no more than 30,000 Palestinians who left in 1947 who are still alive today, according to the UN, there are 5.7 million Palestinian refugees. What a lot of people don't know or don't like to talk about is that there were more Jewish refugees from Arab Muslim countries than there were Palestinian refugees. Between 48 and 72, more than 800,000 Jews either left or fled or were forced out of their homes in the various Arab and Muslim countries. And many of these countries, like Iran and Iraq, had large Jewish populations that dated their history back thousands of years in some cases. Now, after the armistice in 1949 and the war came to an end, as I said, the goal of the Arab states was not to create a Palestinian state. Instead, what they did was divide it between Jordan and Egypt. Jordan captured Judean Samaria, which came to be referred to as the West Bank, which really isn't a place. It's actually just a relative term of the area west of the Jordan River. And the Egyptians occupied the Gaza Strip. And what is historically interesting is that for those 19 years, the Palestinians, to my knowledge, never once demanded the creation of a Palestinian state in Palestine. They never claimed that they were the indigenous people. The Arab states never talked about creating a Palestinian state in these areas. The Jordanians never considered it. The Egyptians never considered it. And the United Nations never considered it. So for 19 years, all of a sudden, this notion that there should be an Arab state or a Palestinian state, it didn't exist. During that period, especially in the early 1950s, the Jordanians and the Egyptians used the territory they have along Israel's borders to mobilize terrorists to continue to attack Israel. Even after the 48 war ends, for the next number of years, various terrorist groups attack Israel from Gaza and from the West Bank, creating an unsafe, insecure position for the Israelis, who decide that they need to go to war to end the terrorist attacks. And they conspire with the British and French, who had their own reasons for going to war. Namely, they wanted to take control of the Suez Canal, which President of Egypt, Nasser, had nationalized. But over the course of the fighting, Israel is able to capture the Sinai Desert and drive back the Egyptian forces. So in pre-1967, here you had, again, Egypt controlling Gaza. You had Jordan occupying Judea and Samaria. What happened with the end of the 56 war was President Eisenhower was very angry that the three countries had conspired without consulting him. He was busy trying to establish the UN as a peacekeeping body. He was trying to show that the Russians shouldn't be allowed to engage in aggression as they had against Hungary. And all of this turmoil in the Middle East upset his vision of foreign policy. He forced the Israelis to return the Sinai to Egypt, and it was a major blunder that set the tone for the 67 war. That is, he forced Israel to give up the Sinai without getting anything in return from the Egyptians. There was no effort for Egypt to make peace. Instead, Israel just had to unilaterally give up the territory captured. The UN put in a peacekeeping force, which in theory was supposed to prevent Egypt from ever attacking again, but that didn't happen. It proved to be incapable of keeping the peace. In addition to what was going on in the south in the Sinai, Israel was also being attacked by terrorists from the north in the Golan Heights. And if you look at the cross-sectional map here, you can see the Golan Heights was towering above the Galilee. For years, the Syrians would bombard Israel. They would attack the farmers living below. This became increasingly unlivable for the Israelis living in that area. And this helped lead to the Six-Day War. So in 1967, as probably most of you know, Israel launches a preemptive attack, defeats Egypt, recaptures again the Sinai and Gaza. It captures the West Bank from Jordan, and now it also holds parts of the Golan Heights that it captures from Syria. And now it has this expanded map of territories that it's captured. After the war, Israel had thought that it would be able to achieve peace, that it had so humiliated the Arab states that they would realize that they had no chance of driving the Jews into the sea, of defeating Israel, and that they would be willing to make peace. They were quickly disabused of that notion with the Khartoum summit, where the Arab states basically said, we're not going to recognize you, we're not going to negotiate with you, we're not going to make peace with you. And in 1973, they make good on their promise by invading with their secret attack on Yom Kippur, October 6, 1973. At the end of the war, Israel again is holding parts of the Golan Heights. It's holding the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and it's holding the Sinai from Egypt. Over the course of the next several years, Israel negotiates with the Egyptians to return the Sinai in exchange for peace. And one of the interesting things about that history, for those of you who may not know, is that Jimmy Carter saw himself as the Messiah, that he thought he was capable of bringing peace to the Middle East, and he was going to do it all at once by bringing together all the Arab states for an international conference with Israel, and they were going to reach an agreement for peace for our time. The Egyptians recognized that this was a disaster for them because they knew that the other Arab countries would veto any sort of peace agreement with Israel, and that Egypt wouldn't be able to get what it wanted, which was the Sinai back. So Anwar Sadat, the president, begins secret negotiations with Israel on his own. He flies to Jerusalem in 1977, breaks the psychological barrier, and infuriates the Carter administration. They were absolutely apoplectic when Sadat went to Jerusalem because it foiled their whole idea of this international conference that was going to bring this messianic peace Carter envisioned. He adapted eventually and helped mediate the final agreement, of course. It took years before King Hussein had the courage to make peace on his own. Of course, the Israelis had relatively good relations with the Jordanians for most of their history, that they had been conducting secret negotiations even from the 1940s on, but it's not until 1994 that King Abdullah is willing to, King Hussein is willing to make the deal to give up the war with Israel. The Israelis make some largely symbolic concessions in terms of land, but mostly they simply agree that there's going to be peace without any concessions, and no concessions to the Palestinians. This is another thing that, as we talk today about possible normalization with Saudi Arabia, you keep hearing from, especially during the Biden administration, that the only way there can be a peace with the Saudis is if there's a Palestinian state created, or if there's some movement toward a Palestinian state. Well, the Egyptians basically abandoned the Palestinians to get peace with Israel because they didn't care about the Palestinians. And then the Jordanians did the same thing. They made peace without any concessions to the Palestinians. The Israelis, though, believe that they need to have an agreement specifically with the Palestinians. Yitzhak Rabin reaches an agreement with Yasser Arafat to recognize the PLO. The PLO recognizes the state of Israel, promises that it's not going to engage in terrorism anymore, that it's going to only negotiate. And they reach this agreement where Israel gives up part of the West Bank, about 18%, which is all of Palestinian control. About 22% they give partially to the Palestinians under joint control, but 60% remains under Israeli control, with the idea that over the course of the negotiations, Israel's going to give up more and more of Area C and more of Area B to eventually create a Palestinian entity. Yitzhak Rabin never said he was going to allow the establishment of a Palestinian state. This is sort of a misunderstanding about history. If you look at his final speech before his assassination, he explicitly says this. But in the end, Oslo ends up a failure because the Palestinians renege on their promise not to engage in terrorism. Terrorism actually increases over the next several years. Israelis become less and less convinced that giving up any land will result for them in peace. And in the meantime, they become more and more involved with fighting in Lebanon. In 1970, the Palestinians who had been driven out of Palestine or had left Palestine in 1948 had basically established themselves as a state within a state in Jordan and tried to take Jordan over. King Hussein in Black September 1970, in part with the help of Israelis willing to back him up, drives the Palestinians out of Jordan, and they make their homes in Lebanon, where they again basically create a state within a state and use Lebanon as a base to attack Israel. In 1982, Israel decides it's not willing to take the attacks from Lebanon any longer, engages in what turns out to be an 8-year war in Lebanon. By the end of the war in 2000, Israel had been occupying a small part of Lebanon, a security zone, along with Lebanese Christian forces. The number of casualties in Israel had grown. Dissatisfaction with Israel continuing to be mired down in Lebanon led to the decision to withdraw all of its troops. And as a result, you had the growth of a new organization called Hezbollah, which had begun to attack Israeli and Christian forces in that security zone. It had been created by Iran as a means to both attack Israel and to carry out the Iranian objective of destroying Israel, but also to take effective control of Lebanon. Let's skip now up to Gaza. In Gaza, you had about 2 million Palestinians living among, for a time, 9,000 Jews. Many of the Jews moved to Gaza because they had gotten certain incentives from the Israeli government. Some moved because they considered this part of the homeland of the Jewish people, even though it didn't have the same kind of religious significance as the West Bank. But they established these various communities, and the Israeli army was having to defend them and protect them against the 2 million Palestinians who wanted to destroy them. In 2005, Ariel Sharon decides this is no longer worth the cost to protect this small number of people. He orders the withdrawal of all of the Jews who lived there. I actually was there the day before most of the troops moved in to force people out who didn't leave voluntarily. And the expectation was that this could create the possibility for peace. Up until this point, one of the mantras you heard all the time was land for peace. If Israel would just give up land to the Palestinians, it would have peace. And the Palestinians would be able to create a Palestinian state that would coexist side by side with Israel. So here you had a laboratory, a real life laboratory test of land for peace. Israel gave up the Gaza Strip. They withdrew from, they left behind greenhouses that were a multi-million-dollar export industry for the settlers. Instead of using that industry to build the economy and build the infrastructure for a state, Hamas destroyed most of the greenhouses or used them for bases. Israel left behind the settlers' homes, and the Palestinians said, well, you know, we don't live in single-family homes like the settlers did. We want to build high-rise apartment buildings. Well, the international community gave them billions of dollars to build a infrastructure for a state. And I can tell you that where I live, houses are pretty expensive, but I can tell you that $1 billion will buy you a house here. But with more than something like $9 billion, the Palestinians did not build a single house for a single person or a single refugee, and they kept the Palestinian refugees in the same camps they were in under Israeli rule. And this is, again, just a sidebar. You know, when people talk about Palestinian refugee camps, they neglect to mention the fact that many of the Palestinian refugee camps are under the control of Palestinians. Why is it that there are refugee camps in Gaza under the control of Hamas? And why are there refugee camps in the West Bank under the control of the Palestinian Authority? Nothing stops them from putting away or ending these camps and putting everyone into permanent housing. It's part of the strategy of having an ongoing representation of victimhood, and also as a place where they can basically incubate terrorists. So Israel leaves the Gaza Strip. Instead of deciding to build the infrastructure for a state, Hamas overthrows the Palestinian Authority government and decides to create the infrastructure for a terrorist state. They import rockets from Iran. They build some on their own. They build an underground network of tunnels. And for years, and many people don't remember this, they only think about what happened after October 7th, but long before October 7th, from 2007 on, the Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad were bombarding Israel with thousands of rockets. It's not until October 7th, 2023, that the Palestinians launched their invasion, where they are able to breach what was thought to be an impenetrable border in multiple locations. As you know, they overrun a number of the communities, the kibbutzim, the Nova Music Festival. They kill over 1,500 Jews. Some of them are massacred in the most horrific ways. They take 251 hostages. As I mentioned, one of the things that they did with all of the money they got was, instead of building a state or attending to the welfare of the Palestinian people in Gaza, they used the money to build a tunnel network. Israel knew there were tunnels, and they had destroyed many of them in prior operations. But by the time October 7th came around, Israel discovers that they have this massive tunnel system that goes hundreds of miles, often compared to the subway system in New York. And this is something that Israel has to dismantle and has been working on dismantling for the last 18 months and still has not completely done it. Israel counterattacks after the massacre on October 7th and has been focused on both getting the hostages back and in destroying Hamas. They have leveled much of Gaza, and the goal has been to create buffer zones so that no Palestinian entity, no Palestinian group can ever threaten Israelis again. So on one level or one area in the border in the north, they've basically leveled everything close to the border to create a buffer zone there. In the south, the so-called Philadelphia corridor, where Hamas had many tunnels going into Egypt that allowed them to smuggle weapons. They also smuggled many of them through the Rafah crossing with Egypt. And Israel believes that it has to control this area to ensure that the Hamas can never again import weapons that can threaten Israel. And they've also tried to divide the Gaza Strip roughly in half with the Netzarim corridor to force the terrorists south to where they can be more easily isolated. Lebanon remains a problem. As you know, even after the Lebanon war, Israel did not destroy Hezbollah's capabilities. It spent the years importing from Iran and smuggling in from Iran thousands of rockets. It was thought that they had 150,000 rockets in October 2023 and that they would be able to fire thousands of rockets at a time to overwhelm the Israeli air defenses. As it turned out, Israel was able to prevent them from launching a October 7th style attack, which they had planned, and took out most of their long-range rockets very quickly. They assassinated their leaders that affected their command and control, and now are in the process of mopping up what's left of the Hezbollah infrastructure in the south. Again, this was the rocket arsenal where Hezbollah was able to reach any part of Israel. This was a sword of Damocles hanging over Israel's head for years before it finally took action after October 7th. Now you have a ceasefire. Israel is trying to ensure there's a buffer zone where the Hezbollah are forced north of the Litani River, where they were supposed to be after the last Lebanon war. They are keeping 5 outposts at least in southern Lebanon to ensure that the Hezbollah are not able to come back. The Lebanese army is supposed to fill the gap and get rid of the rest of the infrastructure. Israel discovered that basically every home in southern Lebanon was a Hezbollah outpost of some kind. Either it was a place where a tunnel entrance was, or it was where weapons were kept. And now that is almost completely been destroyed. The most bizarre thing that's happened after October 7th is the involvement of the Houthis from Yemen. Nobody could have imagined this before October 7th. Israel has nothing to do with Yemen. There's no territorial dispute between Yemen and Israel, but because Iran wanted to keep the Israelis occupied with another front, they used their proxies, who they armed, the Houthis, to attack Israel. The Houthis, who are at this critical juncture where the Red Sea enters the Gulf of Aden, decided they were going to prevent any Israeli ships from transiting the area, and at the same time block all other shipping that was moving through the area. They launched lots of attacks. They sank a number of ships, and Western shipping came to a halt. Most Western ships now take a much longer route that costs more money. Ironically, though the idea was to cripple Israel's economy, very little of Israeli shipping goes through this route, so it's had very little impact. It had a much bigger impact on Egypt, which collects revenues from the ships transiting the Suez Canal, which no longer are able to do so because of the Houthis blocking this area. One of the failures of the Biden administration, I would argue, is that they did not use sufficient military force to stop the Houthis from blocking traffic and from attacking Israel. They were afraid of escalating and getting into a wider war. The Trump administration is being much more aggressive. They're attacking the Houthis every night, but that hasn't stopped Yemen from firing rockets into Israel every day. And the thing about these rockets, even though Israel has shot them all down, or most of them down, roughly 1 million Israelis every night have to run into shelters every time the Houthis shoot a rocket. So they don't have to actually kill anybody or hit anything to terrorize Israel with their attacks. The big enchilada, biggest source of all instability in the region, of course, is Iran. Once an ally of Israel prior to the Islamic Revolution, now you have the mullahs in Iran who have expressed the conviction and commitment to destroy Israel. They, in April 2024, attacked Israel for the first time directly rather than just using their proxies. Fortunately, Israel, with the help of the Arab states and the United States and others, intercepted almost all of the rockets, so they did very little damage. Israel wanted to retaliate in a large way, but they were prevented from doing so by the Biden administration, was afraid that this would lead to a escalation in a wider war that might draw the United States in. Nevertheless, even the pinprick that Israel used was enough to provoke the Iranians to respond in October with a much bigger attack. Again, most of the rockets were shot down by Israel or its allies. And again, Israel wanted to have a massive retaliation and was held back by the Biden administration. The reason the Iranians are so dangerous is they've been working not only on nuclear weapons, but on long-range ballistic missiles, which now have the capability of reaching parts of Europe and, of course, all of the Middle East and Israel, and also U.S. bases throughout the Middle East. And because they're spread so widely through the country, it makes it particularly difficult for Israel or the United States or anyone else to take out their missile capabilities. Now, the main concern for Israel is, of course, nuclear facilities, and the potential was for Israel to attack these nuclear facilities and also their economic hubs, which are the oil, where most of their oil is transited, and also where most of their commercial goods come in. And the thought of many who think that Iran can be crippled is to attack both their economic and their nuclear facilities. But again, Biden was afraid that if Israel were to attack, for example, the economic strategic areas, the price of oil would skyrocket, the economy in the United States would tank, and that would happen just as Biden and later Kamala Harris were running for the presidency and would doom their possibility long before it became obvious they were going to lose anyway. But these are the targets for Israel now. When it did attack, even though it limited what it did, it took out most of the anti-aircraft and other self-defense protection for these facilities, so that if the Israelis and or the United States decide today, these are the targets they will attack. Now, just to end with the Palestinian-Israeli component, again, the notion that so many people have is you have two people fighting over one land, let's divide them in two, we'll have a two-state solution. Well, it's problematic for a number of reasons. One, if you create a Palestinian state in the West Bank, you create the possibility of a terror state like Gaza became within easy range of Israel's major population centers. At its narrowest point, Israel's just 9 miles wide. In Camp David in 2000, Ehud Barak decided, let's forget about this incremental process that we were trying with the Camp David Accords. I'm sorry, with the Oslo Accords. It didn't work going piecemeal. Let's solve this problem all at once. We're going to give the Palestinians roughly 96% of the West Bank. We're going to give them the Gaza Strip. They can create a Palestinian state. They can have some sovereignty in East Jerusalem. And let's be done with this whole issue. President Clinton comes up with a map that looks roughly like this. You're going to have a Palestinian state in this kidney-shaped West Bank. with some sort of means of connecting it with Gaza. And in the meantime, the major blocks of Jewish settlements, this sort of hatched areas, are going to be annexed to part of Israel. And this will be most of the Jews who live in the West Bank. The problem is Yasser Arafat rejects it. He's not satisfied with 97% of the West Bank. He'll only accept 100% of the West Bank plus all of Israel. Over the course of the negotiations, from the days of the peace treaty with Egypt, when Menachem Begin offered the Palestinians autonomy, each time the Palestinians attack Israel, intensify terror, or turn down a peace agreement, all they do is shoot themselves in the foot, because the Jews continue to settle the West Bank. And you can see they're scattered throughout the West Bank, making it difficult, if not impossible, to create a Palestinian state. Today, there are over 500,000 Jews living in the West Bank, 340,000 in Jerusalem, which the Palestinians also consider occupied territory. So how are you going to get all of these Jews out of the West Bank? There's no Israeli government that I could conceive of that would ever agree to force hundreds of thousands of Jews out of their homes. As I said, this is what the Palestinians have done to themselves. If they had agreed to autonomy back in 1980, there were 10,000 Jews in the West Bank. If they would have accepted Camp David in 2000, there were roughly 200,000 Palestinians. They rejected Olmert's offer in 2008. They rejected the peace plan of Obama, and they rejected the Trump peace plan in 2021. And each time, Israel has continued to settle the area and make it that much more challenging for the creation of a Palestinian state, assuming they ever were willing to accept one. The idea, again, if there was a two-state solution, was that you would have most of the West Bank be given to the Palestinians. Since it's not 100%, they would be given a little extra area around Gaza and in other parts of the southern West Bank. And these communities, the consensus communities of settlements, would be part of Israel. But ultimately, this is the problem. And the problem isn't the settlements. The problem is this is the Palestinian vision of peace. There is no two-state solution. There is only one state, and that state is Palestine, that takes the place of Israel. And this is not just the vision of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which want to destroy Israel, but it's the Palestinian Authority's vision as well. This is their map. So in the end, let me finish. Is peace possible with Arab and Muslim states, given the ideology, given the geography? Well, we know that in 1979, a Arab Muslim country, the oldest, most important, Egypt, made peace. It took another 15 years before King Hussein agreed to peace with Israel. Then it took, 26 more years before the Abraham Accords, and you had the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco and Sudan agreeing to peace with Israel. So Israel has peace with all of these Arab Muslim states. And what's interesting, again, with each of these agreements, none of that required Israel to make concessions to the Palestinians. Each of these countries that made peace, first of all, didn't care about the Palestinians in the first place, but recognized that it was much more important to pursue their interests and not allow the Palestinians to veto it. Saudi Arabia, as you know, now has been in negotiations to normalize relations with Israel, and you hear them talk, basically give lip service to the idea that they'll only do it if Israel makes some sort of concessions to the Palestinians. The Saudi Arabians care even less about the Palestinians than any other Arab group, probably. What they really care about is maintaining their royal heads on their royal shoulders. In order to do that, they need a U.S. Military guarantee of some kind. They want more weapons, and they want nuclear technology, which they, of course, say is for peaceful reasons. And you may have heard that just in the last week, the Trump administration was negotiating with them on terms for the nuclear cooperation. Biden came very close to negotiating normalization with the Saudis, but ultimately they couldn't make a deal as long as the war in Gaza was going on. Trump has somewhat of the same obstacle, but ultimately I think the Saudis are going to agree to peace and they're not going to care about the Palestinians. So Israel can have peace. It already has peace with most of its neighbors. The Arab-Israeli conflict no longer exists. The only conflict today is really between the Islamic extremists who will never accept a Jewish state in the Middle East under any circumstances, and Israel's commitment to survive. Let me stop there. You want to learn more, you can find much more in the Jewish Virtual Library. I know I covered a lot of ground and left a lot of gaps, so please, if you have questions, you can submit them in the chat, or we'll try to collate them for me.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation, Dr. Bard. Before I say anything else, just like Dr. Bard says, I encourage you to explore the Jewish Virtual Library website and other resources which offer accessible and reliable information on Jewish and Israeli history, politics, and culture. If you look at your chat box right now, you would be able to see our donation link. We would very much appreciate your contributions to our efforts, as well as links to our social media handles and our YouTube channel. All of this can be found in the chat box. And with that, let us review questions. I see some hands raised. Please, if you can just direct message me with the question, and I hopefully will have enough time to get to it because there's quite a few of them. Let us begin. Angelica Mendez is asking, isn't it correct to say Palestine today? When people say Palestinians, who really are these people today? And isn't that also incorrect to say?
Look, it's not for me to tell Palestinians what their identity should be any more than I would want Palestinians to tell me what my identity should be. The Palestinians are people who have lived in this area for 1,000 years. They first came roughly in the time of the Muslim conquest. The Palestinians today have a nationalistic view. They didn't always have it. And as I said, for many years, they were not interested in an independent state. They were more interested in being part of Syria. But today, I think you have to acknowledge they have a nationalistic view, belief in the right to have independence in what they consider their homeland. But they're not willing to do it without expelling the Jewish state.
Thank you, Dr. Bard. Next question by Natalie. Wasn't it the Roman emperor that renamed Judea Syria Palestina rather than Christians who were persecuted by Rome, the earliest Christians being majority Jewish themselves? Do you mean Christendom under Rome later still referred to the land as Palestine?
Yes, well, I'm less of an expert on Christian history, but certainly Christians became a majority in the Roman Empire over time. There were, we all know that Jesus was a Jew, and it was gradually the Christian religion that overcame the Romans, and the Romans that then ultimately recognized Christianity. And even with the persecution both by Rome and by other civilizations over the centuries, Christianity became the dominant religion in a good part of the world. And they saw this Holy Land as Palestine. That was how they came to refer to it.
Thank you. Mr. David Cohen from Australia, with reference to the invasion of the Arab armies to Israel in 1947. Civil war started on 30th of November 1947, question mark. Did Arabs start the shooting? This seems to be just left out.
Yeah, well, I didn't go into all of the details. You're right. Basically, the Jews and Arabs were killing each other from the beginning of the 20th century. The Mufti of Jerusalem, who was the leader of the Palestinians in the 20s, 30s, and ultimately became a collaborator with Hitler, was really the first to demonstrate that the radical Islamic agenda was the destruction of the Jews. Even before there was a Jewish state, he was leading the effort to prevent Jews from becoming, having a Jewish state and killing Jews. Fighting continued throughout the 30s into the 40s, and even before the partition decision, they were killing each other. The killings intensified after the partition decision in November 47, and in January, February, March, you had some of the early invasions by Arab irregular forces. So there was fighting going on prior to May 48, no question about it, but it wasn't until May when the Arab armies invaded and had a much more robust opposition to what Israel could face.
Thank you. Next question by Mr. David Minger. After World War II, European nations began worldwide decolonization. Decolonization is the returning of sovereignty to the indigenous people. Isn't the establishment of Israel in 1948 itself a clear example of decolonization?
Well, it's certainly not colonization in the historic sense of another country inputting people into a foreign land for the purpose of exploiting its resources. That was never the Jewish intention. It was never the behavior of the Jewish people who were, again, as you, I think, intimated, were returning to those who had left. Not everyone had left. Those returning to what was their indigenous home. They weren't there to displace other people, and in fact wouldn't have had it not been for the Arab invasion. Remember, the Israelis, Ben-Gurion offered in the Declaration of Independence to allow the Palestinians to remain and become full citizens, and the 150,000 Palestinians who did not leave during 47 to 49 were able to stay in their homes and become full citizens of Israel.
Thanks. Next question. Why is not Jordan considered a Palestinian state since it was part of the Palestine Mandate?
Why isn't Jordan considered a Palestinian state? Well, there are a lot of people who say it is and should be. In fact, as you saw geographically, historically, Jordan was part of Palestine. And the majority of the population, nobody really knows for sure. Some people think as high as 70% of the Jordanian population is Palestinian. Most Palestinians today live in what historically was Palestine. That is, they either live in Israel, they live in Jordan, or they live in southern Syria or southern Lebanon, which had at one point or another been Palestine. Now, the problem with the argument that some people have made that the Palestinians shouldn't have a state in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, they should simply be recognized as having a state already in Jordan. Here's what I see as part of the problem. If you're concerned with Israel's security, what do you think is more dangerous for Israel? A small rump state in the West Bank, surrounded by the IDF and the Jordanians who hate the Palestinians and want to make sure they don't take over Jordan. Is that better for Israel? Or would it be better for Israel if Jordan was the Palestinian state along Israel's border with the full capabilities of an army armed by the United States, trained by the United States and Britain, with access to weapons and alliances with the other Arab states? I've argued in the past that that's much worse in terms of Israel's security than if it were to allow the establishment of a Palestinian state.
Thank you, Dr. Bard. Ms. Shira Macklin is asking, if there is no country called Palestine, why do we still use the word Palestinian?
I'm sorry, if there was no country called Palestine, what?
Why do we still use the term Palestinian?
Well, as I said, first of all, any people who lived in the land of Palestine were referred to as Palestinians. That included Jews, and it also included Arabs. And again, I think that if Palestinians choose to identify themselves as indigenous to Palestine, at least from the time of the Islamic conquest, I don't feel it's up to me to tell them who they are and what we should call them.
Thank you. Mr. C.J. Dwyer is asking, what is the source of the idea of Jimmy Carter seeing himself as the Messiah?
He was, he was a Christian fundamentalist, born again. He thought that he knew the best way to bring about peace in the Middle East. He, was constantly telling everyone how to do it and what to do, and that the best way was to have this international conference that was absurd to believe that if you just brought the Arabs into the same room together, that they would suddenly decide to eliminate their animosity toward the Jews. And because Sadat understood this, he wasn't willing to go along. Later, interestingly enough, you could point out that George Bush did much the same thing by organizing the Madrid conference. But the Madrid conference really proved the point that this wasn't going to solve the problem, because the Madrid meeting didn't result in any agreement for peace between Israel and the Palestinians or any of the other Arab states.
Thank you, Mitchell. And we have a lot of questions, at least 15, but so let's try to make it snappy. Why didn't Egypt and Jordan absorb the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank into their own populations after the 1948 war?
It's an excellent question. It wasn't just Egypt and Jordan. It was Lebanon, it was Iraq, it was Syria. Jordan did more than any of the other countries. It allowed Palestinians to become citizens. It stopped doing that a number of years ago, but at the time it did. But the belief of the Arab states was that the Palestinians basically were pawns to be used against Israel, that if they were seen as this victimized group that needed to be returned to their homes, that meant that Israel would have to be destroyed, because the only way they could come back to their homes to have 1 million or so Palestinians come is if basically Israel committed suicide, and Israel wasn't prepared to do that, and still isn't. What Ben-Gurion and the Zionists and the Israelis said in the 1950s was, look, we're willing to take something like 100,000 Palestinians back if you agree to make peace. But the Arab states were never willing to do that. And again, after 1967, the idea was that since Israel had humiliated the Arabs, surely they would make peace. And under those circumstances, there would be some way of solving the Palestinian refugee issue. But they weren't willing to make peace. And by the way, the UN Security Council Resolution 242 is the basis for all peace talks since 1967, and it doesn't mention the Palestinians at all. It only mentions refugees, and refugees also could refer to dealing with the Jewish refugee problem and compensating them for losing their homes and well-being.
Thank you. Can we hear more about the 96% offer that Arafat rejected in Ehud Barak's time? Was it only about the land area, or did Israel demand other limitations on Palestinian autonomy?
Well, the Israelis always have maintained that a Palestinian state should be demilitarized. From the Israeli perspective, it makes perfect sense that Palestinians shouldn't be able to arm themselves, for the very reason we saw on October 7th. I've always thought that was a little bit unrealistic, just as, again, as we saw in Gaza. It's very difficult, if not impossible, for Israel to prevent the Palestinians, if they had a state, or as they had in Gaza, from getting weapons to threaten them with. That was one of the main restrictions on them. But otherwise, Israel was going to control airspace. It was going to insist on having control over the borders and certain other security guarantees that it saw as necessary to prevent what subsequently happened on October 7th.
Thank you. Next question. Why does the Western world allow multi-generation hereditary status only to Arabs from what was the Palestinian territory?
It's a good question. I think it's an outrage that they do. You know, that there is a UN body for refugees, and it is responsible for the refugees everywhere in the world except for the Palestinians. And there's really, I would argue, no excuse for them not to also be responsible for the Palestinians. And using their criterion, the Palestinians would not be able to continue to multiply in numbers on the refugee rolls, that you wouldn't be allowed to have this kind of acceptance of all descendants as being refugees as if they all had left in 1947. So, you know, there are lots of people who have called for this kind of a change. You know, one of the things that, you know, people may not want to admit today is that Israel supported UNRWA for many years, that there were people in Washington, I know, because I was on Capitol Hill at the time, who were interested in defunding UNRWA. You know, this was in the early 90s, mid 90s, and the Israelis were against it because they saw UNRWA as unsavory as it is in many ways, as the only way to meet the welfare needs of the Palestinians. And you heard this argument, you know, up until even very recently, that you can't do away with UNRWA because who else is going to take care of the Palestinians? The Israelis don't want to take care of them. And so there had been a movement in the past to defund UNRWA. Now the Trump administration has defunded it again, but the rest of the international world still believes this is the only way to ensure that Palestinians are taken care of.
Thank you. Next question. Do you see any chance for Trump's idea to resettle the Gazans to really materialize? And what are the most likely places for them to go?
Will the Palestinians be forced to leave to go to other countries? I don't see that happening. Nobody likes the Palestinians. Nobody wants the Palestinians. You know, remember, this is another thing that isn't often remembered. In the Gulf War, when the Palestinians supported Saddam Hussein after Iraq invaded Kuwait, Kuwait expelled 300,000 Palestinians. There were no UN resolutions. There was no uproar. There were no campus encampments protesting the expulsion of 300,000 Palestinians. You know, no one in the Arab states wants them. Egypt specifically made a deal with Biden at the very beginning of the war. And I think this was a major mistake by Biden that led to much of what happened after, which was that the Palestinians would not be forced to leave Gaza. I happen to believe that if at the beginning Biden had said to the Egyptians, you need to let the Gazans out, let them set up temporary refuge in Sinai, they can get all of the humanitarian aid they need, no Palestinian civilians would have died in the next 18 months. They wouldn't have starved. They wouldn't have had any of the humanitarian crises if that had happened. Biden was against it. And Egypt was against it. Trump also was trying to get Jordan and Egypt to accept Palestinians, and they both said no. He's threatened that he was going to cut off aid. So far as I know, he hasn't done that. There's talk now that there may be some African countries that would accept some Palestinians if they get paid off in some way, but the Arab states are not going to accept them. And where are 2 million people going to go? And how are they going to get there? You know, when you talk about imagery, think of this image for the people who think that all of the Palestinians in Gaza should be expelled and sent to some other country. How is this going to look if one day you turn on CNN or Fox News or any outlet and you see Israeli soldiers bundling Palestinian men, women, and children into buses to transport them out of Gaza. What is that going to remind every person on the planet of? That's not, I think, a image Israelis want to see, and I don't think it's going to happen. The Palestinians are going to be, most of them are going to be stuck in Gaza, it seems like, for the foreseeable future, and they're going to end up living on international subsistence and aid.
Thank you, Dr. Bard. And for some more critique questions, rather, what is your take on the Palestinian claims about the Nakba and the massacres that took place in certain villages like Deir Yassin? We had another participant also asking about the killing of civilians unaffiliated with Hamas in Gaza in the current war.
Look, there were no question that there were Palestinian civilians killed both in the 48 war and killed in the Gaza war. The fact in the Hamas case that they used them as civilian shields is one of the main reasons for the large number of casualties. But, you know, can you argue that Israel should have been more careful, should be more careful, do more to avoid civilian casualties? They're already doing more than any other army has ever done in history. But you still have Palestinians dying nonetheless. And, you know, there's certainly no escaping some of the responsibility for that. In terms of 47 and the alleged massacres, you can read, you know, we have an extensive materials on Deir Yassin and some of the other instances in the Jewish Virtual Library. But basically, what happened in many of those places in the 47 and 48 war, where the Israelis were having to capture certain areas that were threatening to them in one way or another. In Deir Yassin, the Irgun originally was claiming having killed lots of people that it ultimately hadn't. There were reports of 250, 350 people being killed. But if you look at the New York Times and the other media coverage of what happened at Deir Yassin, there's no mention of a massacre at the time. And people who've done deep research, including people, Palestinians, have found that there were probably roughly 100 Palestinians who were killed. Many of those were fighters. Some of them were people who tried to dress up as women and were killed in the fighting. But there, you know, there have been cases of massacres that have been committed by Israeli soldiers, and I think they've been recognized in certain historical contexts. But they have to be remembered in the context of the wars that they were conducting.
Thank you. We're going to take a couple more questions. We want to respect your time, and then we're going to wrap it up. Regarding Hezbollah, I have a question here. Sorry, there are so many questions. And I apologize that we can't get to everything, but you are more than welcome to reach out to us via email, and we'll be happy to answer. 1 second. There is a question about, is Hezbollah a political party in Lebanon more than just a military presence?
Well, Hezbollah is a terrorist organization. It's a puppet of Iran that was used to essentially take over Lebanon. It has members in the Lebanese government. The Israeli decimation of Hezbollah and the Lebanese government's finally showing some backbone after decades has created the opportunity to weaken Hezbollah to the point where it will no longer have the kind of influence that it's had for the last 20 or 30 years. But the government has to do a number of things. It started to do them. It has to take control of southern Lebanon. It has to disarm Hezbollah. The president of Lebanon just said this week that he believed that there had to be all the weapons in the hands of the Lebanese government, which essentially was a euphemism for disarming Hezbollah. Hezbollah said that will never happen. Lebanese government has taken steps to prevent some of the smuggling as has the new Syrian government to prevent some of the cross-border smuggling. Israel has threatened the Iranians that they will shoot down any planes because they were flying weapons and money into Beirut airport, and the Lebanese government's apparently stopped that. So yes, Hezbollah was able to build a political machine, just as Hamas did in Gaza, largely by providing social welfare to the people. The government in Lebanon and the Palestinian Authority in Gaza wasn't able to provide for the means of the people. And because Hezbollah and Hamas were able to provide for some of their needs in terms of schools and in terms of food and some other aspects of the economy, that was one of the things that enabled them to become popular and to gain the political control that they did. But that's beginning, certainly crumbled in Gaza, and it's crumbling, I believe, in Lebanon as well.
Thank you, Dr. Bard. And we'll wrap up with a final question, a philosophical question, rather, by Ms. Karin Altman. How does one even solve this holy war, given all the complexities that you just highlighted throughout this presentation and the question?
Well, it's a good question. Today people don't like to believe there is such a thing as a holy war. You hear it dismissed all the time that, we're all alike. It's a sort of universalism. There's no difference between people here and people there, that there are no such thing as religious extremists. If we just all sit down together and talk, we can settle our differences. But the reality is, there have been religious wars going on for centuries. The religious war is not just between radical Islam and the Jews. It's a war between radical Islam and Western civilization. Remember, the goal of Khomeini and Khamenei, the mullahs in Iran, is not to destroy Israel. That's not their goal. That's like a speed bump on the way to their overall goal, which is to once again try to conquer Europe, which they're making progress doing, by the way, in indirect ways. But the radical Islamists are at war with all infidels. And for them, Sunni Muslims are also infidels. The Iranians are at war with the Sunni states. That's why there's a conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran and the other Sunni states. So how do you solve a religious war? I'm not sure that there is any way that you can end it. You can only try to contain it and be willing to fight and recognize that it exists and to fight against it. You can't pretend, as some past administrations do, that there really is no war going on. There is no radical Muslims who are out trying to destroy Western civilization or kill Jews and Christians. They exist, and there are more of them than many people would like to admit. We have to be able to recognize it and deal with it and fight it as best we can, but it's not going to disappear anytime soon that I can foresee. Let me just say one last thing before Or wraps up. We'll be having more of these webinars, and I think the next one will probably be in the next 2 or 3 weeks, and it will be about Arab funding for American universities. And that's a topic that I think you're seeing in the news, and you'll find very interesting, that I've done a lot of research on, and we'll be happy to talk about. Thank you all for joining us. I'll let Or say goodnight.
Yes, thanks again, Dr. Bard. Just a couple of logistical questions that I want to refer to. Mr. Arthur Green, thank you for your patience. One thing is regarding the recorded presentation. Yes, as we usually do, we will provide a recording of this webinar. I know that some of you want to revisit it or want to join parts that they weren't able to view. So yes, we will provide a recorded link to our webinar that will exist in our YouTube channel. And regarding the sharing of the presentation, I received a couple of inquiries from people that wanted to see if you are willing to share the presentation itself with our audience.
have to give some thought to that, since that's intellectual property, but it may be possible to share some of it.
Sure. So we will keep you posted on that. So just a couple more words. Thank you again, Dr. Bard, for the insightful and deeply informative presentation. You've helped us visualize not only the geography of this conflict, but also the layered history, political decisions, and ideological tensions that have shaped it from colonial borders to present-day diplomacy, and even before that. We're talking about the transformation of the land over the past 3,000 years, including the political implications of British and UN decisions, the context of Arab-Israeli wars, the Israeli settlements, and the missed opportunities for Palestinian statehood. It is a complex story, but one that is essential to understanding not just for the past, but also for the way forward. We appreciate everybody here that joined us for this conversation and encourage you to stay informed and engage. The Jewish Virtual Library will continue to provide in-depth analysis of these critical topics, so please be sure to visit our website. And as I mentioned earlier, we have the links to our social media handles, to subscribe to our newspaper, and of course, to support our efforts through the donation link. I want to acknowledge that, once again, this is the eve of Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, and this conversation carries added weight. As we remember the 6 million Jews murdered during the Holocaust, we are reminded of the dangers of historical distortion and the importance of education rooted in truth. May today's session serve as a lesson in history and geopolitics, and a tribute to the memory and the enduring need to confront misinformation with knowledge. That is what JVL does. Thank you all very much for joining us, and have a nice evening.
Thank you, and good night.